Hi everyone, welcome to Aquatics by Nature and part 2 of the plants I grow in this 28-year-old low-tech, no water change, no fertiliser aquarium. If you haven't seen part 1, I'd recommend watching that first, as it'll give you a slightly better background on this video, so I'll put a link in the description for you anyway. Today I thought I'd address probably the two most important plants in this tank, together with one of my absolute favourite aquarium plants. So anyway, first up, undoubtedly the most important plant in this aquarium, and that's the water lettuce, Pistia stratioides. This obviously is a floating plant, which I'm sure many of you are aware. It has these rather nice floating leaves, and it gives the tank a really nice sort of cover from the surface. And when you have lots of it on the surface like this, it actually gives the whole tank a kind of a green lustre, which I kind of rather like. It's just makes it look extremely lush in that respect. But it also makes it look a bit like a sort of mystical forest with all those kind of roots hanging down. It's rather spectacular and rather attractive, I think. But one of the bonuses of having floating plants is it makes your fish feel much more relaxed and much more sort of secure. One of the reasons for this is that in nature, most of the predators that fish would encounter actually come from above, birds and things, for example. So having a certain amount of cover makes your fish feel much more comfortable and at home. It's really quite amazing how fast this plant grows, especially considering this tank has no fertilisers at all. It's literally surviving just off the waste products from the fish food that I add. It's quite a testament to how efficient nature can be. You're probably wondering why or how does this plant manage to grow so fast on what seems like such a limited diet, as it were. Well, one of the main reasons for this is something called the aerial advantage. Some of you may have come across this term before, but basically what it means is that the plant is not CO2 limited. Because its foliage is actually above the water, it's able to access CO2 from the atmosphere, unlike plants that are underwater, which are somewhat limited in that respect. This gives it a huge advantage because it can basically suck up CO2 to its heart's content. So it's actually limited really by the nutrients, i.e. the fish food in my case. And there obviously is plenty of fish food to keep it ticking along in this tank. The roots themselves actually are also very important, as well as being highly attractive. They're often described as a hotbed of biological activity. You could actually argue that if you have a gentle current of water flowing through these roots, it's probably a more efficient biological filter than the one you've actually added to the tank. So certainly think of that and bear that in mind. You'll also find that a lot of the animals really like it. The Amano shrimps always spend a lot of time actually hanging on the roots, and they're clearly feeding off of something microscopic. That probably is that biofilm and everything that goes together with that sort of biological filtration. They certainly enjoy it anyway. And you sometimes also see them hanging onto the leaves and actually feeding on the surface film of the water, which again is quite a useful trait because it keeps any surface films and things away. But another really big advantage of this aerial advantage, as it were, is that because of this very fast growth, it enables the plant to suck up all sorts of nasty things in the water, whether that's anything from nitrates, phosphates, heavy metals, pesticides. It can be a whole manner of things. But this all does absolute wonders for your water quality. And it's undoubtedly the plant that's doing I would describe it as the heavy lifting in this tank. And it's the plant that enables me more than anything not to do water changes in this tank. The thing to remember in this respect is that you must be removing the excess growth regularly, partly to make sure it's not covering too much of the water surface and cutting off gas exchange, but mainly and most importantly, the nutrients that it's sucking up are only removed from the system when you actually remove the plant, so you must always do that. Obviously, if you go to my sort of criteria that I have for plants, this is an incredibly functional plant, so it definitely ticks that box. It's also such an easy plant. It literally floats in the tank and does its own thing. It's so easy to grow, so it fits my sort of second criteria, as it were. It does need reasonably good light. Being a plant that's floating on the surface rather than underwater means that it would get full sunlight in nature. So it is, I won't say demanding, but it doesn't really like dull tanks in order to grow strongly and actually function properly and be that functional plant that we all sort of need and want. It needs quite good light to do that. It also needs quite good ventilation. It doesn't do very well if you have a very tight fitting lid where it gets extremely humid and sort of sweaty, especially if you're running air stones. Sometimes you'll find it'll actually go mouldy under those circumstances. But there are other plants, incidentally, that you can grow in those conditions that perform the same task, but I'll come to those in future videos. It seems also to like, certainly with my tanks anyway, slightly older tanks. I found that this tank, in actual fact, when it started off and for many, many years, the dominant plant that used to take up this function was actually just duckweed. I used to do exactly the same thing and just crop the duckweed regularly and remove the nutrients that way. But I gradually let the water soften in this tank because it's a tetra tank. And eventually, almost overnight, the duckweeds just died. And then from then onwards, the water lettuce took over. It's obviously definitely a soft water plant in nature. So it's able to take up nutrients in conditions where duckweed clearly can't, which is quite a useful thing to remember, actually. Certainly in terms of the cover, you need to be a little bit careful. If you allow it to cover too much of the surface, as I say, it can cut off the gas exchange too much and you can end up with fish gasping, so you have to be quite careful. A very rough rule of thumb that I kind of have is I never let the floating plants cover more than half of the tank, and then when they do, I basically crop them back to about a quarter of the tank. So never remove them entirely, but just keep knocking them back regularly. And it's just that little bit of regular maintenance, removing all those nutrients, that will do wonders for your tank. And for all of these reasons, I think it's about the most perfect plant for natural aquariums. It does and has everything that you need, both aesthetically and functionally. It's simply a wonderful plant that is highly recommended by me, certainly. And then secondly, we come to Najas guadalupensis, more commonly known as guppy grass. I'm sure many of you know this plant. It's such an incredibly adaptable and incredibly easy plant. It'll grow in most tanks, and it's just a really nice, easy plant. It's incredibly fast growing, like the water lettuce. In this tank, some of you probably have noticed that it's gone from just being a very limited amount of it in the centre of the tank to really quite a thicket of it in really quite a short space of time. And a bit like the water lettuce, it's rather amazing just how fast it can grow, literally just from what's being recycled from just a little bit of fish food being added regularly. It tends to like moderately hard water. It's probably not a plant if you have extremely soft water, but if you've got any reasonable amount of hardness, it seems to do really well. It'll grow rooted into the substrate or just as a floating plant or just literally free in the tank. It's not terribly fussy. You'll find that the habit and the growth pattern that it has varies enormously as to where it's growing and what kind of conditions it has. The plant you can actually see in this tank at the moment is actually a little bit sort of sparse and thin. That's mainly because of the amount of cover from the tiger lotus and the water lettuce, reducing the amount of light. If it's out completely in the open under strong light, it can be much, much more dense and it can be a real thicket. And one of the reasons that I think it gets called guppy grass is because it's great for hiding baby guppies and stopping them getting eaten by their parents. But that works much better when it's floating or in those really dense thickets, as it were. It's actually quite a strange plant in that it's actually rather brittle. And in some ways, it's quite a redeeming feature, actually, because what I find happens in this tank is little bits will break off from time to time and they'll float around the tank and then they'll just nestle normally amongst the cryptocoryons at the bottom and then they just take root. So I get this sort of constantly evolving sort of natural sort of landscape or aquascape in the tank. As I said, at the moment there's lots of it in the middle of the tank, but I will shortly be removing that and there's already lots of little pieces rooted into other parts of the tank which will simply take over and replace it. You rarely find this plant sold by any aquarium shops, mainly because it is so brittle and difficult to transport. But having said that, it's normally very easily available if you just search for it online. There's often lots of fellow hobbyists with spare plants wanting to sell them for a little bit of a profit. So you're probably wondering, why does this plant do so incredibly well in so many different tanks? One of the main reasons for this is a bit like the water lettuce. It has a little bit of a trick up its sleeve. it's actually able to extract CO2 from the bicarbonates in moderately hard water. And this gives it an advantage over a lot of different aquarium plants. There are other plants that are able to do this, but this one is particularly well known for it and particularly good at it. And as you can see in this little bit of film here, when it's really under strong light, it actually produces so much oxygen this way that it actually pearls. The bubbles you can see are actually oxygen bubbles coming off the plants. So it's quite incredible what a plant can actually do. They have lots of different strategies. But because of this fast growth, again, it's a fantastically functional plant. Just like the water lettuce, it's great for your water quality. It sucks up all those horrible nitrates, phosphates, pesticides, and goodness knows what. And once again, it's one of the main reasons that I don't need to do water changes on this tank. And certainly between the water lettuce and the guppy grass, they do most of the heavy lifting in this tank. But once again, to take advantage of this, you must remove growth regularly. You're always only removing those nutrients when you're removing excess plant. If you allow them to decay back into the tank, you're simply letting the nutrients go back into the tank. And that's when in the long term you tend to come unstuck. So basically, a quick recap. As far as my criteria are concerned, it's an incredibly functional plant, wonderful for your water quality. It's incredibly easy to grow. It'll grow in most tanks, except probably very soft water tanks. It might struggle a little bit, but certainly if you've got any moderate hardness to very hard water, it really loves it. Its maintenance is incredibly simple. If it's floating, you simply just remove it. If it's rooted, you just simply nip it off at the very base. It's very quick, very easy to do, and just remove the excess when you need to. And because of the way it grows, again, there's no need to disturb the substrate in any way. A, it doesn't root terribly firmly, and B, you can just nip it off. As I say, it's very straightforward. So again, like the water lettuce, it's one of my kind of ideal plants, if you like, for natural aquariums. It's something that I would highly recommend. And then finally today, we come to one of my all-time favourite plants, the tiger lotus lily, Nymphaea lotus, which is sometimes referred to as Nymphaea zenkeri. Certainly if you've got an older book or what have you, it's likely to be that. I've had this plant around about 20 years. It was actually originally given to me by a friend, but I've had it ever since then. And for those who aren't familiar with this plant, it's actually a tropical water lily. And I've always loved water lilies ever since I was a kid. We always had them in the pond in the garden. And like most water lilies, its growth is actually seasonal. Despite it being a tropical plant, it does tend to have a growth season and then a dormant season. And in this particular tank, it tends to come up in the autumn, and then it grows like crazy until the spring, and then it literally disappears completely underneath the substrate. So it's only literally there around about half of the year. One of the things that I really like about it is that every year it pops up in a different part of the tank, which is kind of fun. I like this kind of random kind of aquascaping. And as you can see, the main plant in this tank this year has actually decided to come up at the front right hand side of the tank, which it's never actually come up there before. It's generally been in the back corner that it's come up, and there are actually some smaller plants there, but the main plant, as I say, is at the front. But I don't mind it there. It looks quite good, and having the leaves on those long stems is rather attractive in many ways. My particular plant is actually a little bit unusual in that it's basically a green leaf with kind of reddish flecks on the leaves. Most of the ones you see today tend to be more of a red leaf with dark flecks, and personally I rather like the contrast of the green and the red, but some people may like the red on the red. It's really just a matter of taste. But one of the lovely things is no two plants are ever the same. You always get this sort of random nature with them, which is kind of a nice thing to have anyway. Like most water lilies, they actually have two types of growth. Initially, when they start to emerge, you get this underwater growth, which tends to be sort of slightly undulating, much softer leaves, which you can see here. And they're extremely attractive, but they're actually quite short-lived. The plant really wants to put up floating leaves like a traditional water lily, really as quickly as it can. Also, you'll find that the floating leaves, when they come up, they tend to be this very dark, very heavily spotted sort of leaf. And then these wonderful markings, as the leaves age, actually tend to turn green, or certainly less flecked anyway. So you get this kind of transition. But it's quite a useful thing, which I'll explain later, because it enables you to tell the difference between the new and the old leaves. I think it's in many ways one of the most exotic looking plants that you can actually grow in an aquarium, and I think for this reason alone they're kind of a must-have really. In actual fact, one of the most exotic things about this plant is actually the undersides of the leaves. When you actually turn over a mature leaf like this, it's actually quite spectacular. It really is this colour. It's bright purple with these fantastic veins too, and an amazing leaf structure. It's just one of my favourite plants, as I'm sure you've guessed by now. You also find out, a bit like the water lettuce, lots of the animals, like the shrimps in particular, they love hanging on to the leaves. And again, they tend to feed off of the surface and help to keep the surface film clear, which is always a very useful trait to have. And again, like the water lettuce, having a certain amount of floating cover helps make your fish feel much more secure. And you'll find it makes your fish less jumpy, and you tend to get much better colour actually out of your fish as well, simply because they're more settled. And also having leaves coming right up from the base of the aquarium, floating on the top, it gives that kind of different dimension. In a strange way, I think it makes your tank look almost more three-dimensional. It's just really lovely. And actually, although this plant actually has a seasonal growth pattern, it's actually quite a functional plant nevertheless, albeit for maybe 6 months of the year. Just like the previous two plants, it grows really quickly. And again, just like the water lettuce, it has the same aerial advantage. If you let the leaves float on the surface, it can access CO2, grow like crazy, and suck up all those horrible nitrates and things once again. As I say, all three plants today are really useful plants to have in the tank. One little side note actually, some people don't allow these tiger lotuses to have floating leaves. They nip them off in order to sort of keep the growth in check. But you tend to find over time this weakens the plant, because it needs to put those leaves up and access the CO2 to grow strongly enough to actually make a tuber. And because of the seasonal growth pattern, if the plant can't make a tuber, it has no survival mechanism to get it through its winter, as it were. So you generally find it, if you don't allow them to have floating leaves, sooner or later the plant will just fail to come back, and then you'll end up having to keep buying new ones, which is fine if you like to keep trying different ones, but I like to keep things as sort of self-perpetuating as possible. Again, it's an incredibly easy plant. When you buy them, because they have a tuber, they have that kind of storage mechanism, so it enables them to kick into growth really very, very easily and very, very quickly. But when you do buy them, always make sure you get the bulb. Sometimes you see them just sold as plantlets, and they very, very rarely tend to grow. They really would have to be pampered in order to make a bulb for you. It's much, much more straightforward to actually start off with a bulb. Again, maintenance is crazy easy. All I do is actually remove leaves if you get too many. I tend to only let them have maybe 3 or 4 floating leaves at a time, because they create too much shade and again cut off the gas exchange too much. So again, it's just a little bit of regular pruning. And going back to what I said earlier, that the leaves you want to remove are actually these green-looking leaves, not the ones that are very heavily mottled. The reason for this is those green leaves are the older leaves, so you always want to be removing the old leaves first. If you keep removing the new leaves, again the plant is likely to sort of fizzle out and not be quite so good in that respect, and you may actually lose it. Again, there's no need to disturb the substrate. You just keep nipping the leaves off, and when they actually go dormant in the end, you'll find that all of the leaves will gradually just go yellow and fade away, and you just nip these all off, and then you simply have to wait until the plant decides it's spring again. And I think one of the reasons that this plant tends to come up in the winter, in this particular tank, is that I actually don't heat the tank terribly warmly in the winter. So the tank actually has a natural sort of cycle of seasons. In the time that the lily comes up tends to be slightly cooler, and then in the summer when the tank runs warmer, the plant tends to go dormant and just sort of disappear, as it were. It is quite a good sized plant, and it's not perhaps something you want to plant in a very small tank, but if you've got a reasonable sized tank, I mean this tank it's only basically 3 feet long, so it's not a massive tank, but it is big enough to maintain one of these. Like the water lettuce, it needs quite good light because of the floating leaves, but it's not overly fussy at the end of the day. And if you're really, really lucky and you have really nutritious substrate in your tank, it might even flower. You tend to get a white or a pink night blooming flower, which can be quite well scented in actual fact. But unfortunately, I've never actually had one in this tank. I think the nutrient levels are a little bit too low. But it's still a very nice plant to have. And being a covered tank, it's not terribly practical to have flowers poking out the top all the time anyway, so I don't mind really. But again, it's just one of those wonderful plants that I think everybody should try at least once. And it's quite functional and certainly very, very attractive and easy to grow, so I would highly recommend it. I think I'll leave it there for today. And then hopefully in part 3, I should be able to cover all the rest of the plants that are in this tank for you. So you should have the full range of things that I'm growing. If you'd like to know more about how I maintain these plants so naturally, without water changes or fertilisers, I'd be eternally grateful if you subscribe and give me a like. And if you'd like to help this channel grow further and reach more people, please share as well. You can also check out my playlists, but most importantly, enjoy your aquarium. Don't be a slave to it. Thanks for watching. And as usual, I'll let the video play on for a little bit for those that like to watch the fish. Thank you.